The restricted sniper lane erupted with the unmistakable signature of a perfect shot, fired from a distance where no one was authorized to be shooting. A soft alarm chirped once, then twice, cutting through the afternoon heat. Range spotters froze mid-call, their binoculars still pressed to their eyes as the digital scoring board refreshed and confirmed what their instincts refused to accept. The shot was legitimate. It was real. And it had come from somewhere it shouldn't have. Navy SEAL trainees stared downrange, irritation spreading across their sun-weathered faces like wildfire. Senior instructors moved with urgency, boots pounding against concrete, already certain this was a violation of range protocol. Someone had crossed a clearly marked line, and whoever it was would answer for it. The consequences would be swift and public. Voices rose in sharp bursts. Accusations stacked on top of each other, overlapping and contradictory. One operator laughed and declared it had to be a system malfunction, the targeting computers glitching under the relentless combination of desert heat and accumulated dust. Another voice sneered that support staff should stay in their designated lanes and leave actual shooting to the professionals who had earned the right to be there. That was when she stepped forward. A quiet female armory technician emerged from the equipment shadows. The rifle balanced in her hands with an ease that suggested familiarity, not bravado. She didn't rush her movements. She didn't apologize or offer explanations. Her face displayed no defiance, only complete control. The mockery around her sharpened instead of stopping. Boots scraped against concrete as people shifted positions for a better view of what was about to unfold. Radios crackled with clipped, uncertain chatter. Cell phones lifted just high enough to record without appearing obvious. The entire range held its breath, suspended between judgment and something no one present was ready to name yet. BF. Or we continue. Make sure to subscribe to The Final Watch so you never miss these authentic tales of courage, discipline, and the warriors who serve in silence. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. The woman in the worn uniform. Chief Petty Officer Mara Ellison stood in her late 30s, though most people who encountered her guessed younger. She carried herself with an economy of motion that suggested neither fatigue nor wasted energy. Her current assignment on paper appeared simple and thoroughly unimpressive: range armory support and logistics coordinator. She was the person who signed rifles in and out of the secure vault, tracked serial numbers in meticulous logs, and ensured ammunition counts matched perfectly at the end of each training day. Her uniform told the same understated story. The fabric had worn thin at the elbows from years of use, washed too many times until the original navy blue had faded to something closer to gray. Her hair was secured tight at the back of her head in a regulation bun, practical, forgettable, with no loose strands to draw unwanted attention. There were no visible decorations on her chest. No shooter qualification tabs. No morale patches that hinted at specialized training or prestigious assignments. That absence spoke volumes to those who bothered to notice. On a range crowded with elite shooters and operators, appearances carried enormous weight. Patches announced experience before voices did. Qualification tabs declared worth before a single round left the chamber. Mara wore none of them, and she never bothered to correct the assumptions that inevitably followed. She avoided attention not from fear, but from deeply ingrained habit. When instructors barked orders across the firing line, she acknowledged them with short nods instead of verbal responses. When direct questions came her way, she answered only what was specifically required, nothing more, nothing less. For Mara, silence was not a sign of weakness. It was discipline forged through years of experience most people in that room couldn't begin to imagine. She knew exactly why the range was staring at her now. She understood the precise distance of the shot, the subtle wind shift that had occurred just seconds before she squeezed the trigger, the way barrel temperature would settle just enough to maintain zero. None of it had been luck. None of it had been accidental. She also knew what it would cost if she tried to explain. Explaining would mean revealing names. Names would mean accessing restricted records. Records would mean opening doors she had spent years keeping carefully closed. So she chose the same path she always did. She said absolutely nothing. The gathering storm. Senior Chief Logan Pierce observed the unfolding scene with tightly controlled restraint. As the range operations lead, he governed his world through procedure and schedules, through comprehensive checklists and strictly enforced clearance levels. Emotion had no place in his decision-making process, and uncertainty irritated him on a fundamental level. To Pierce, Mara Ellison represented a variable he hadn't planned for in his carefully organized system, and that alone transformed her into a problem requiring immediate resolution. Chief Instructor Tyler Rook Harland embodied the opposite approach. He filled physical space with his voice and thoroughly enjoyed doing it. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a permanent scowl that had become his trademark, he believed dominance and leadership were functionally identical. Public humiliation served as his favorite instructional tool, and he wielded it instinctively, especially when someone dared to challenge his authority without explicit permission. Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Crowe stood one calculated step back from the active firing line, her uniform immaculate and every detail perfect. She valued hierarchy above all other considerations, and she enforced it socially long before she ever needed to invoke it officially through paperwork. To Crowe, Mara's presence near that rifle represented an affront, not because of any genuine safety concern, but because of optics and the appearance of disorder. Petty Officer Blake Turner hovered close to the equipment racks, eyes narrowed behind a mask of technical curiosity. He had built a reputation for escalating performance tests and pushing operational limits under the guise of maintaining standards. If someone failed his challenges, it proved his expertise. If they succeeded, it irritated him deeply. Either outcome kept him in control of the narrative. Seaman Cole Avery barely tried to conceal his anticipatory grin. Young, confident, and constantly seeking attention from senior personnel, he angled his phone just carefully enough to capture faces without making his recording obvious. To him, this moment felt purely entertaining. Someone was about to suffer embarrassment, and embarrassment always made for compelling stories worth sharing. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Ruiz said nothing at all. She leaned casually against a support post near the back of the range, arms crossed, eyes sharp and continuously assessing. Ruiz had witnessed enough real-world chaos during multiple deployments to recognize immediately when something didn't fit the expected pattern. She watched Mara's hands more intently than her face, noting the way they settled naturally on the weapon, the complete absence of hesitation or uncertainty. Sergeant First Class Noah Kincaid stood beside Ruiz, experiencing an unsettled feeling for reasons he couldn't immediately identify. As an Army Ranger liaison assigned to facilitate joint training operations, he had spent years around shooters, medics, and operators from every branch of service. Something familiar lived in Mara's posture, in the way she measured distances across the range without moving her head, in the controlled economy of her breathing. It bothered him the way a half-remembered dream does, hovering just beyond conscious recognition. Mara felt all of it without visible reaction. She checked wind conditions without consulting instruments, eyes narrowing slightly as dust particles shifted along the earthen berm downrange. Her grip adjusted by pure instinct, thumbs settling into a firing position she didn't need to consciously think about. These were habits burned into muscle memory through endless repetition, not extracted from training manuals or classroom instruction. A faint scar traced along the inside of her forearm, barely visible beneath her sleeve when she shifted her weight. To most casual observers, it resembled an old workplace injury, perhaps caught on equipment or sustained during routine maintenance. To anyone who understood such things better, it told an entirely different story. When Mara did speak, she paused first. Not because she was searching for appropriate words, but because she was choosing them with deliberate care. That pause reflected discipline, not doubt. Fear rushes people into hasty speech. Training slows them down, teaches them to measure every word before release. Around her, assumptions hardened into certainty. They observed a support role and automatically filled in the remaining details. They noticed the absence of qualification patches and decided she possessed none worth earning. They mistook her restraint for submission and her quiet demeanor for ignorance. It was easier that way, simpler to categorize and dismiss. Mara had learned long ago that correcting people's misconceptions rarely changed their fundamental thinking. Allowing them to reveal themselves through their own actions accomplished far more. So she stood there, steady, controlled, and silent, while judgment circled closer from every direction. The range buzzed with mounting tension. Every set of eyes waited for her to either explain herself or break under the pressure. She did neither. She had survived far more dangerous rooms than this one. She had stood under heavier scrutiny with significantly more at stake than wounded pride. Whatever happened next, she would handle it exactly the same way she always had, with complete control, remaining unseen until the moment demanded otherwise. The first challenge. Chief Instructor Harlan finally broke the suspended moment with a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the tension. He stepped forward with deliberate force, boots striking concrete with authority, and pointed dramatically downrange toward the target system. He declared that if she had fired that perfect shot once, she could certainly fire it again. If the performance represented genuine skill, it would repeat under observation. If it had been luck or accident, it would fail spectacularly. Either way, the range would settle the question definitively and publicly. The crowd leaned in immediately, drawn by the promise of resolution. Chairs scraped backward against concrete. Operators from adjacent firing lanes drifted closer, curiosity temporarily overriding their training discipline. This was no longer about safety protocols or range regulations. It had transformed into something more primal, about proving someone wrong in front of witnesses, about maintaining the established hierarchy. Mara Ellison did not argue or protest. She adjusted her stance with minute precision, checked the chamber without being instructed, and settled behind the rifle with practiced ease. Her breathing slowed until it became nearly imperceptible. Not shallow or forced, simply absent from conscious thought. She waited patiently for the wind to shift, not watching the range flags, but feeling the air movement against her exposed cheek. The shot cracked once across the desert silence. The digital scoring board refreshed its display. Another clean centermass hit bloomed on the screen in perfect digital clarity. For a single heartbeat, absolute silence dominated the range. Then voices collided all at once in confused chaos. Someone cursed under their breath with genuine disbelief. Another voice demanded the entire targeting system be immediately recalibrated. Harlan's jaw visibly tightened, irritation flashing into something sharper and more personal. He waved off the range spotters before they could even begin their standard verification procedures, his authority suddenly less certain than it had been mere moments earlier. Escalation. Petty Officer Blake Turner stepped forward next, eyes bright with the gleam of challenge. He announced that static targets meant absolutely nothing in real-world applications. Authentic shooters adapted to changing conditions. Real operational pressure involved movement and unpredictability. He ordered the automated target system fully engaged, steel silhouettes that would slide into random, unpredictable patterns across the far berm. This time there was no laughter rippling through the gathered crowd, only intense anticipation. The entertainment value had transformed into something more serious, more consequential. Mara shifted her position slightly. Not to achieve comfort, but to establish correct alignment. She tracked the first moving target without rushing her shot sequence, fired once with controlled precision, and smoothly transitioned. The second target dropped. Then the third. Her firing cadence never changed or accelerated. No wasted ammunition. No dramatic displays of speed designed to impress observers. Just precision measured and delivered with absolute finality. The steel targets dropped one after another in steady succession. Several operators exchanged uncomfortable glances, their expressions tightening as confidence drained away. The atmosphere that had filled the range minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by something distinctly uneasy. This wasn't showmanship or lucky coincidence. This wasn't an elaborate stunt. It was pure competence stripped of all flourish and pretense. Someone behind the firing line muttered that this performance wasn't normal for support personnel. The easy laughter that had carried through the air earlier never returned. Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Crowe stepped closer, her voice remaining smooth and carefully controlled as she changed the angle of challenge. She acknowledged that marksmanship represented one dimension of expertise, but understanding represented something entirely different, something more valuable. She gestured toward a large tactical planning board mounted near the range operations office and formally requested that Mara explain the shot in comprehensive detail. Wind calculations, elevation adjustments, terrain analysis, all of it. Mara rose slowly from her firing position and approached the board without hesitation. She accepted the marker extended toward her and began immediately. She didn't start with the target itself. She started with the land. The briefing. She drew the ridge line from memory, not artistically precise, but exact in tactical placement. She marked the low valley where afternoon air naturally pulled and pooled, the subtle elevation rise where heat distortion bent trajectories just enough to matter at extended range. She traced wind corridors with calm, confident strokes, explaining in measured tones how the breeze had shifted twice before reaching her firing lane. As she spoke, her voice remained absolutely even. No trace of bravado or superiority. No condescending teaching tone. Just facts delivered with the confidence of someone who had lived these calculations under conditions far more demanding than a training range. She explained why her first shot had deliberately waited for optimal conditions, why the second shot had come faster once she'd confirmed her calculations, why the steel targets had fallen in the specific sequence they did. She discussed extraction angles and fallback routes without being prompted, about maintaining sight lines and exploiting shadows, about tactical considerations that lived well outside standard training manuals. The officers listening grew progressively quieter. Senior Chief Pierce folded his arms tighter across his chest, unease visibly settling into his expression. He recognized the terminology she employed. More significantly, he recognized the bone-deep confidence behind it. This wasn't classroom recitation or memorized doctrine. This was operational memory. Cell phones gradually lowered throughout the crowd without anyone being explicitly ordered to stop recording. Screens dimmed. Conversations cut short mid-sentence as words failed those who had been so certain moments before. Whispers replaced jokes as people leaned closer, not to mock anymore, but to genuinely listen and learn. Seaman Cole Avery quietly slipped his phone into his pocket, his earlier grin completely vanished. He glanced around uncertainly, no longer sure where to position himself now that the moment had turned so decisively against initial assumptions. Being early to laugh felt entirely different when laughter no longer had social cover. Harlan's face hardened into something resembling stone. He stated flatly that someone must have coached her extensively. Nobody developed that kind of terrain awareness from a support role assignment. He suggested she had received unauthorized help off-range or accessed training materials she wasn't cleared for. His words now carried more accusation than logic, more defensiveness than authority. Another voice added that she must have somehow stolen credentials or falsified records. Someone else muttered darkly that her entire background should be immediately checked and verified. The atmosphere changed again, shifting from grudging respect toward something more threatening. Standing ground. Mara absorbed it all without visible reaction. She capped the marker deliberately and stepped back from the board, hands returning to her sides in a neutral position. She did not defend herself against the accusations. She did not explain the years of training and operational experience behind those instincts. She had learned through hard experience that explanations offered too early were rarely believed by those determined not to believe. Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz watched the officers instead of watching Mara. She observed shoulders tensing, eyes avoiding direct contact with each other. This confrontation was no longer about a single Impressive shot. It had evolved into something more fundamental, a system suddenly realizing it might be catastrophically wrong about someone it had already judged and dismissed. Sergeant First Class Kincaid felt his recognition deepen into absolute certainty. He had witnessed this exact dynamic before. Not this specific person, but this precise posture. The way certain individuals stood when they had already survived far worse judgment than anything a training range could deliver. The way operators carried themselves when they had nothing left to prove. The accusations continued, growing louder and more frustrated. Mockery had failed to break her. Demonstrated skill had unsettled them. So suspicion naturally took its place as the final defense mechanism. Mara remained perfectly still, absorbing the verbal assault without flinching or retreating. The attention she had carefully avoided for years now pressed in from every direction, heavy, unavoidable, and intensifying. Around her, the range grew progressively quieter by the second. Even the desert wind seemed to pause in anticipation. Radios crackled once and fell silent. Nobody wanted to be the next voice that got this situation wrong. Harland finally stepped back, not in defeat, but in visible recalculation. Crow's expression tightened further as her authority faced challenge not through defiance, but through undeniable evidence. Pierce glanced toward the operations office, already mentally reviewing personnel files and security clearances. Mara stood at the absolute center of it all, not elevated, not protected by rank or position, simply present and unmoving. She had repeated the shot exactly as demanded. She had answered their technical questions completely. She had done everything requested of her with precision and professionalism. And still, it wasn't enough. That realization settled over the entire range like an approaching shadow. This confrontation wasn't going to end with applause or simple dismissal. It was evolving into something else entirely, something sharper and considerably more dangerous than mere embarrassment. Uncomfortable silence spread thick across the range. Whatever came next would decide far more than who had taken that initial shot. It would define how authority responded when confronted with unexpected competence from an unexpected source. If you're finding value in this story, hit that subscribe button for the final watch. These stories preserve the legacy of those who serve with honor and distinction. The scar. The first person to truly notice the scar was the unit medic, standing slightly removed from the main group with her arms folded across her chest. At first glance, it appeared completely ordinary, a thin, pale line running along the inside of Mara's forearm, half concealed by the cuff of her uniform sleeve. But when Mara shifted her grip on the weapon during transition, the angle changed and the medic's eyes narrowed with professional recognition. That scar wasn't from any training mishap or routine accident. It wasn't the shallow, uneven mark typically left by range equipment or careless handling of tools. It was clean and deliberate, the kind of wound that came from something sharp and violent, treated quickly under field conditions and pressure. The medic said nothing aloud. She didn't need to articulate her recognition. The way she looked at Mara fundamentally changed in that instant, casual curiosity replaced by something much closer to professional respect. Others began watching Mara's hands now with renewed attention. Not the shot results displayed on screens, not the distant targets, but specifically the way she handled the rifle between firing sequences. She didn't cradle the weapon like a borrowed tool requiring careful attention. She moved with it as though it belonged to her, as though it represented an extension of her own balance and deeply ingrained muscle memory. Her weapon handling was subtly wrong for her assigned job. Anyone who actually worked armory support operations understood the regulations about maintaining distance, proper demonstration posture, and safety protocols. Mara followed none of the habits expected of someone whose primary duty kept them behind the firing line in an administrative capacity. Her grip was tighter, more economical, clearly built for situations where mistakes carried immediate consequences rather than simple corrections. The prediction. A gust of wind moved across the open range, subtle enough that most personnel completely missed it. Before the range flags began to shift, before the spotters could make standard adjustments, Mara lifted her head slightly and stated calmly that wind was about to approach from the left. Not loudly, not as a warning to halt operations, just a simple statement of meteorological fact. 3 seconds later, the flags confirmed her prediction exactly. That observation caught serious attention. A range safety officer had opened his mouth to call a temporary halt when Mara spoke again, quietly correcting the angle calculation of an adjacent firing lane before his words were even completely formed. The officer froze mid-sentence, checked his instrumentation panel with surprise, and then nodded slowly in acknowledgement, realizing she was absolutely correct. Mara didn't smile at his confirmation. She didn't look around to gauge who had noticed her environmental awareness. She simply stepped back into her previous position of stillness, as if accurately predicting atmospheric conditions was as natural to her as breathing. Senior Chief Pierce felt the situation shift yet again and found he didn't like it at all. This confrontation wasn't simply about marksmanship anymore. Patterns were emerging from the chaos, and patterns always demanded proper answers through official channels. He turned decisively toward the range operations office and motioned to the safety console operator, requesting an immediate personnel verification check. The range safety officer hesitated briefly, uncertain about the appropriate protocol. He typed Mara's name into the system, expecting a straightforward support personnel profile, something simple, clear, and thoroughly unremarkable. The screen paused longer than it should have for a basic query. Then it locked completely. A restricted access notice filled the entire display, the kind of security warning that didn't explain itself or provide details. No specific denial, no helpful information, just a stark message that proper clearance was required well beyond his current authorization level. He tried the query again, typing more slowly and carefully this time. The exact same result appeared. The officer swallowed hard and glanced first toward Pierce, then toward Lieutenant Commander Crow. He didn't announce aloud what he had discovered on the screen. He didn't need to make any verbal statement. The color visibly draining from his face communicated everything necessary. Recognition. Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz had been observing the operations console from the very beginning of this confrontation. She watched the safety officer's hands abruptly stop moving, saw the obvious hesitation, witnessed the subtle but unmistakable shift from professional confidence to genuine caution. Her eyes flicked back toward Mara, then returned to carefully study the officers who were now quietly reassessing every assumption they had made. Ruiz didn't intervene or offer commentary. She waited and observed. This was not her moment to speak or explain. This was a critical moment to watch carefully, to see who paid genuine attention and who stubbornly doubled down on flawed initial judgments. Sergeant First Class Kincaid felt his stomach tighten with certainty. The restricted personnel file confirmed what his tactical instincts had been quietly whispering since Mara first stepped forward to that firing line. He had encountered shooters exactly like this before during joint operations. Men and women who carried their operational history inward, who moved through the world as though survival was a habit they could never completely unlearn. He remembered a mission years ago in an undisclosed location where the quietest person in the Tactical Operations Center had ultimately proven to be the most dangerous and capable individual present. He remembered not knowing their actual rank until circumstances made it impossible to avoid asking directly. Mara stood at the absolute center of intensifying scrutiny, fundamentally unchanged in her bearing. She noticed the glances, registered the way conversations lowered to whispers, felt the manner in which authority figures suddenly stopped making casual jokes. She observed eyes focusing on her scar, on her hands, on the way she tracked environmental conditions without requiring tools or instruments. Still, nobody stated her actual rank aloud. Nobody named a specific unit or command. Nobody confirmed what an increasing number of people were beginning to suspect with growing certainty. That deliberate silence was not accidental. It stretched the moment unbearably, forced the entire crowd to sit with profound uncertainty. It allowed imagination to fill the gaps, and imagination often carried more psychological power than bare facts ever could. The range felt fundamentally different now. Not hostile or actively mocking anymore. Cautious, the specific kind of caution that emerged when people suddenly realized they might be standing far too close to something they didn't fully understand and couldn't properly control. Mara kept her gaze directed forward. She did not volunteer additional information. She did not correct the conclusions forming behind her back through whispered speculation. She had learned long ago that truth carried significantly more weight when it arrived on its own terms rather than through forced explanation. Around her, the mystery deepened with each passing second. The scar, the environmental instincts, the restricted personnel file, none of these elements proved anything definitive by itself. Together, however, they formed a shape that nobody wanted to name out loud, even as it became increasingly obvious. The fundamental question remained unspoken but hung in the air like a held breath: who exactly was Mara Ellison, and what had she done before arriving at this training range? The range knew something significant now. It just didn't yet know why that significance mattered so profoundly. The search. Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Crow's patience finally fractured, not exploding into anger, but hardening into calculated administrative action. She straightened her already immaculate uniform and delivered her next order calmly, as though issuing completely routine instructions. She formally ordered a locker search and inspection. If there was truly nothing to hide, she stated with cold precision, then complete transparency would efficiently end this disruptive situation. Her logic appeared sound on the surface, but everyone present understood the real motivation. This was no longer about security or protocol. This was fundamentally about reasserting control over a situation that had slipped away from authority. The atmosphere on the range shifted again, tension ratcheting higher. Two junior petty officers moved cautiously toward the armory corridor, their steps notably more careful now than they would have been an hour earlier. Mara followed without resistance or protest. She properly cleared her rifle and handed it off according to standard procedures, her posture remaining completely unchanged. She had expected this exact moment. It was always where these confrontations inevitably went when skill embarrassed established authority enough to threaten it. The locker door opened with a dull metallic creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the focused silence. Inside, everything was arranged with absolutely deliberate simplicity. No clutter whatsoever, no personal effects meant for display or decoration, just pure function. A compass sat carefully in a small padded protective case, its metal edges worn completely smooth from years of reliable use, not ceremonial display. Practical and well-maintained, the kind of equipment that had been genuinely relied upon in demanding conditions, not simply admired. Someone picked it up with curiosity and immediately frowned. It wasn't standard issue for the current base or any recent training command. The make and model suggested specialized procurement. Beneath the compass lay a compact sidearm that had been extensively modified in ways that immediately captured Blake Turner's full technical attention. The grip angle had been professionally adjusted. The sights were distinctly non-standard. The trigger pull had been reduced to a weight lighter than regulations permitted on any training ground. This was absolutely not a weapon customized for competitive shooting or personal comfort. It had been built specifically for maximum speed under combat stress. An old challenge coin rested at the very bottom of the locker, its surface dull from literal years of handling. No inscription remained visible at first casual glance. Just worn metal that had clearly mattered to someone for a very long time. The small room grew intensely quiet. Crow stepped closer, irritation now bleeding obviously into her voice despite her attempts at control. She demanded to know where the modified weapon had come from. She demanded to know who had authorized such specific modifications. She demanded to know why an armory support technician was carrying specialized equipment she couldn't immediately account for through standard channels. Mara answered only what was specifically and directly required. She stated that the items were properly logged. She confirmed they were legally hers. She did not elaborate or explain further. That disciplined restraint enraged Crow far more than open defiance ever could have. The breaking point. Crow closed the remaining distance between them, her voice dropping lower but becoming noticeably sharper. She stated that cooperation was no longer optional. She stated that Mara would provide complete explanations immediately and without further delay. When Mara remained silent, maintaining her disciplined composure, Crow made a critical mistake born of frustration. She reached out and grabbed the front of Mara's uniform, fingers curling into the fabric just below the collar. The motion was fast, emotional, and completely inappropriate for an officer. A profound mistake. Mara reacted before anyone else in the room could fully process what they were witnessing. Her body turned smoothly, weight shifting with practiced precision as her hand trapped Crow's wrist and rotated it just enough to break the grip without causing injury. It was a textbook close-quarters defensive response, precise, controlled, and ending almost as soon as it began. Crow stumbled backward, more shocked than hurt by the speed and efficiency. Mara released immediately, both hands coming up with palms open in a clear non-threatening gesture, stepping back deliberately to create safe distance. No follow-through, no dominance display, no escalation whatsoever. Just distance and complete control. The collar of Mara's uniform tore slightly in the defensive motion. For a fraction of a second, nobody noticed what that tear had revealed. Then someone did. Just below the fabric line, faded but completely unmistakable, a tattoo curved along her collarbone. Not decorative. Not recent. A sniper cell marking, worn down by time and sun exposure. Part of a tactical call sign was partially visible, the letters incomplete, but more than enough to be recognized by those who knew exactly what they were looking at. The air left the room as though a vacuum seal had broken. Sound didn't gradually fade. It vanished completely and instantly. Every conversation stopped at once. Radios fell silent. Boots froze in mid-step. The confidence that had filled Crow's posture moments earlier collapsed entirely into disbelief. Her authority had not simply been challenged, it had been exposed as fundamentally misplaced. Senior Chief Pierce stared at the revealed tattoo, his procedural certainty visibly unraveling. Blake Turner swallowed hard, his technical objections dying unspoken in his throat. Seaman Avery stood completely motionless, his earlier bravado erased by sudden realization that he had been recording entirely the wrong person. Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz closed her eyes briefly, not in shock, but in recognition. She had seen markings like that before, on people who never discussed them voluntarily. Sergeant First Class Kincaid felt the tension in his chest snap into absolute clarity. The familiarity he couldn't place now had definite shape. This wasn't coincidence. This was operational history standing in front of them, quietly asking to finally be acknowledged. Crow took another step backward, her face visibly pale. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again without sound. Whatever authority she believed she held over this situation no longer applied. Not here. Not now. Not ever again. The truth emerges. Mara remained exactly where she stood, hands still raised for a beat longer than strictly necessary. When she finally lowered them, the movement was slow and absolutely deliberate, a clear signal to everyone watching that the moment was over if they wanted it to be. She did not threaten. She did not lecture. She did not claim anything or make demands. She simply stated quietly that no one had been harmed and no one needed to be. The restraint in her voice carried more devastating weight than anger ever could have. It reminded everyone in the room that she possessed the capability to escalate this confrontation dramatically and had explicitly chosen not to. That choice echoed louder than the shot that had started this entire situation. Crow adjusted her uniform carefully, avoiding Mara's direct gaze. The room waited desperately for someone in authority to take control again, but nobody moved forward. Nobody spoke. They were all recalibrating internally, trying to understand how badly they had misread the situation from the very beginning. The challenge coin still rested in Crow's hand. She looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time, then placed it carefully back in the locker without any comment. Mara calmly retied her collar, covering the tattoo once more. The mark disappeared from direct view, but its presence lingered powerfully in everyone's awareness. You couldn't unsee it. You couldn't pretend it hadn't been there. You couldn't return to the assumptions that had existed 5 minutes earlier. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly and completely. Where there had been confidence, caution now ruled. Where there had been judgment, uncertainty dominated. Authority no longer moved forward with certainty. It retreated, waiting for reinforcement it suddenly understood it desperately needed. Mara stepped back into her previous position near the range, returning to stillness. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken protocol beyond necessary self-defense. She had de-escalated a physical confrontation with discipline that spoke of long operational experience. Whatever assumptions had been made about her were gone now, stripped away by a single controlled defensive movement and a glimpse of truth nobody had as cared for but everyone had needed to see. The silence that followed was not awkward or embarrassed. It was reverent. Everyone in the room understood the same thing simultaneously. They had crossed a line without knowing it existed. And the person they had tried to corner had deliberately chosen restraint over humiliation. That choice unsettled them far more than any accusation or display of dominance ever could. The Admiral. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the suspended stillness first. Tires rolled slowly across gravel, deliberate and unhurried, followed by the measured rhythm of boots falling into perfect formation. Word moved ahead of the vehicles without anyone saying it out loud, spreading through the range like electricity. A flag officer had arrived. When Rear Admiral Thomas Caldwell stepped onto the range without ceremony, his mere presence tightened the atmosphere the way barometric pressure changes before a storm. He had come for an inspection that was supposed to be completely routine. Instead, he found a room frozen in place, authority stalled, all eyes fixed on a single figure near the firing line. Caldwell took 2 measured steps forward and stopped, his gaze locking onto Mara Ellison. For a moment, nobody understood why. Then the realization began to spread, slow, heavy, and undeniable. Caldwell didn't look confused. He didn't appear surprised. He looked certain. He crossed the remaining distance in complete silence. Nobody moved to intercept him. Nobody spoke or questioned his purpose. The range seemed to physically shrink around the sound of his boots as he came to a halt directly in front of her. Then he raised his hand and saluted. Not casually. Not out of habit or automatic protocol. The salute was sharp, precise, and unmistakably deliberate, the kind rendered to someone who had genuinely earned it through service, not simply rank. Mara stiffened in pure reflex before conscious thought caught up. She returned the salute cleanly, her entire posture snapping into place with the same discipline that had governed every single movement she'd made all morning. Caldwell held the salute for a beat longer than protocol technically required. When he lowered his hand, he did not immediately turn to address the others. He kept his eyes on her, recognition passing between 2 professionals who understood exactly what service meant. Master Chief Ellison, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent range. The title landed like a physical weight dropping onto concrete. He identified her with absolute certainty, a former special operations sniper, a senior enlisted operator whose service record was not for public discussion or casual review. His tone made it completely clear that this was not information to be debated, dissected, or questioned by anyone present. Nobody asked questions. Nobody dared. The Admiral finally turned to face the rest of the range. He did not lecture immediately. He did not raise his voice or issue threats. He simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back in a position of authority, allowing the implications to settle naturally over everyone present. Faces that had once carried absolute certainty now held visible disbelief. Shoulders that had squared in confident authority slumped under the crushing weight of realization. The hierarchy everyone thought they understood had inverted completely without warning, and they were still struggling to process it. Caldwell said nothing else for a long moment. The silence did the work for him. It stretched long enough to force genuine reflection, long enough to strip away every excuse and justification that had been building. Every person present was left alone with their earlier words, their laughter, their baseless assumptions about someone they had never bothered to truly see. Mara remained perfectly still, eyes forward in proper military bearing. She did not seek this moment. She did not claim it as vindication. She endured it because duty required her to, because respect for the Admiral's authority demanded it. The Admiral gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. Then he stepped back slightly, leaving the space between them charged with unresolved tension and unspoken history. Only after that did the range seem to breathe again, but nothing about it felt remotely the same as it had an hour earlier. The respect in the air was no longer theoretical or assumed. It was anchored in reality, earned long before anyone in that room had known her name. And for the first time since that initial perfect shot was fired, nobody questioned who had taken it. They already knew. They just hadn't known what it meant until now. The lesson. Rear Admiral Caldwell finally turned back toward the assembled instructors, operators, and support staff. When he spoke, his voice was even and measured, the tone of someone who did not need to assert authority because it was already absolute and unquestioned. He said that Master Chief Mara Ellison had served in places most people in the room would never see, under conditions that did not allow for mistakes, ego, or second chances. He did not name specific operations. He did not name locations or theaters. He did not need to provide those details. He summarized her record the way one would summarize weather after a devastating storm, brief, factual, unavoidable in its impact. He explained that she had been selected, trained, and trusted as a sniper in a special operations environment where discipline mattered infinitely more than confidence, and restraint mattered infinitely more than recognition or public acknowledgement. He said she had completed her service without seeking attention or accolades, and that her decision to work quietly on a training range was not a demotion or punishment, but a deliberate choice, a choice made by someone who had already carried enough operational weight for several lifetimes. No medals were listed in detail. No numbers were recited. No body counts or mission statistics were offered. The absence of specific detail made the truth heavier, not lighter. It allowed imagination to fill the gaps with appropriate gravity. Around the range, heads lowered almost instinctively. It was not a gesture of submission, but of realization and shame. Voices that had been sharp and mocking minutes earlier softened into nothing. Nobody clapped or cheered. Nobody shifted their feet nervously. The silence was complete, heavy, and for the first time, genuinely respectful. Caldwell let it sit for several seconds, allowing the weight to accumulate. Then he said the sentence that fundamentally changed the shape of the room and everything that would follow. Judging people by appearance gets people killed. He did not raise his voice when he said it. He did not look at any one person in particular. He said it as a statement of absolute fact, the way someone does who has personally witnessed the cost firsthand, who has stood over flag-draped coffins because someone made an assumption they shouldn't have. He explained with deadly calm that combat did not reward arrogance or confidence, it punished both mercilessly. That operational experience often looked completely unremarkable until it was too late to replace it. He said the most dangerous mistake any military unit could make was believing that skill and competence announced themselves loudly through patches, tabs, and chest candy. Nobody argued. Nobody attempted to explain or justify their earlier behavior. There was nothing left to defend, no ground left to hold. Chief Instructor Harlan stared at the ground, his earlier dominance completely evaporated. Senior Chief Pierce's procedural certainty had fractured into something quieter and more honest, the realization that checklists and clearance levels meant nothing if you couldn't recognize competence when it stood directly in front of you. Lieutenant Commander Crow stood rigid, eyes forward, understanding fully now that her actions would not disappear quietly into paperwork or be forgotten. There would be consequences. Reviews would be opened. Conduct would be examined under bright lights. Caldwell did not list those consequences out loud. He did not have to threaten or specify. The implications were crystal clear in the way he paused between sentences, in the weight he gave certain words. Reassignments would follow. Career reviews would be initiated. Authority would be measured against actual behavior, not simply rank or position. Accountability had entered the room with the Admiral, and it was not leaving quietly or quickly. Mara remained exactly where she was, hands relaxed at her sides. She did not look relieved by the vindication. She did not look triumphant. If anything, she looked tired, the deep fatigue of someone who had been forced to reveal something they had worked hard to keep private. The recognition had not lifted a burden so much as acknowledged one that had always been there, invisible to those who hadn't earned the right to see it. The Admiral glanced back at her once more, his expression carefully unreadable, then addressed the range as a whole with finality. He said this moment would be remembered not as an embarrassment for those involved, but as a correction, a necessary correction for a system that had allowed assumptions to override judgment. He said the lesson was simple, even if accepting it was profoundly uncomfortable. Respect was not something you earned by being loud, by wearing the right patches, or by dominating others. It was something you owed to every person you served with before you knew better, before you understood their full story. That truth settled slowly but completely over the assembled group. A few people swallowed hard. Others shifted uncomfortably, adjusting uniforms that suddenly felt tighter. Nobody met Mara's eyes directly now. Not purely out of shame, though that was present, but out of genuine humility, the recognition that they had been wrong in ways that mattered. Caldwell stepped back, signaling the end of his remarks. The authority he carried lingered in the air even after he stopped speaking, changing the molecular structure of the space itself. The range felt fundamentally different now, stripped of bravado, noise, and false confidence. Mara finally exhaled, a small breath she had been holding since the locker door first opened. She did not smile. She did not nod in acknowledgement. She simply stood, letting the moment pass without claiming ownership of it. The climax was not loud or dramatic. There was no triumphant cheer, no gesture of victory. There was only the quiet, powerful understanding that something fundamental had shifted in this place, and that everyone present would carry the lesson with them long after the range went cold. The respect was real now. It had been earned years ago in places nobody would ever discuss. And it had come at a cost nobody present would ever forget. Resolution. The range slowly began to empty, not with the usual noise and relief that followed training days, but with quiet, purposeful movement. Conversation stayed low and subdued. Eyes avoided direct contact. The lesson had already taken root deep in the consciousness of everyone who had witnessed it. Mara Ellison waited patiently until most of the crowd had dispersed before turning toward Chief Instructor Harland. He stood near the edge of the firing line, shoulders heavy with the weight of realization, staring at the concrete as if it might offer answers or absolution. When she approached, he looked up with visible uncertainty, the authority he had worn so easily earlier completely stripped away. She did not confront him. She did not deliver a lecture or demand an apology. She simply reached into her pocket and placed a challenge coin in his hand, the same worn coin from her locker. It was old, edges worn completely smooth from years of being carried, the kind that had been valued more than displayed. The weight of it surprised him. He looked down at the metal, then back at her, waiting for words that never came. Mara simply nodded once. That was all. A single acknowledgement that said everything necessary without speaking a word. She turned and walked back toward the armory without waiting for any response. No lesson delivered verbally. No judgment spoken aloud. The coin said everything she needed it to say. It represented a bridge offered, not a gap maintained. When others attempted to thank her or apologize, she deflected with quiet efficiency. Praise slid past her the same way mockery had earlier, acknowledged but not absorbed. She logged equipment back into the system with the same precision she always had, checked ammunition counts, and returned the range to proper operational order. Duty reclaimed her attention because duty had always been the fundamental point. To Mara, recognition was never the reward. Completion was. Doing the job right, every single time, regardless of who watched or understood. The narrator's reflection. The story closes with a reflection on what true strength looks like in military service. Strength rarely announces itself with loud voices or bright markings. It does not demand space or attention. More often, it waits, patient, disciplined, invisible until the precise moment it becomes absolutely required. Genuine experience hides in plain sight more often than people realize. It blends seamlessly into routine, into worn uniforms and quiet habits, into people others overlook because they are not trying to be seen or celebrated. Mara returned to her assigned role without ceremony or fanfare. She stood in the same place she had occupied before that shot echoed across the range. Nothing about her posture changed. Nothing about her pace or routine altered in any visible way. The difference was not in her at all, but in how others now watched and understood. Respect followed at a distance now, subdued, thoughtful, genuine. Not because it had been demanded or forced, but because it had been earned long before anyone in that room had noticed. The recognitio. N came years late, but it came completely. The range resumed its normal rhythm by late afternoon. Targets were reset. Rifles were cleaned and properly stored. Orders were given with noticeably more care and consideration. The entire atmosphere had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Some lessons arrive loudly through dramatic moments. Others settle slowly, reshaping how people think and act long after the moment has passed. This lesson did the latter, working its way into the foundation of how this unit would operate going forward. One truth had been established beyond any doubt: respect should be given before it is proven necessary. That truth lingered, quiet and undeniable, in the space where judgment and mockery had once lived so comfortably. Quiet people often carry the heaviest histories. They move through the world without announcing what they have seen, what they have survived, or what they have endured in service to something larger than themselves. They do not ask to be noticed, even when their experience could change everything in a critical moment. The ones ignored today are often the ones who step forward when it matters most. They are the steady hands in chaos, the calm voices when others panic, the reliable presence when everything else falls apart. And sometimes they are the reason entire teams make it home at all. Closing message. Stories like this are not simply about rank or recognition. They are about humility, discipline, and the quiet courage that holds teams together when pressure strips everything else away. They are about seeing people for who they actually are, not who we assume them to be based on appearance. Master Chief Mara Ellison never sought recognition. She sought only to serve with honor, to do her duty with precision, and to maintain the standards she had sworn to uphold. The fact that others had underestimated her was their failure, not hers. The range learned that day what many units learn too late: the most dangerous assumption in military service is believing you know someone's capabilities based on their current assignment or their lack of visible decoration. Combat experience does not always announce itself. Competence does not always demand recognition. And the quietest person in the room might just be the most capable one present. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to The Final Watch so you never miss these powerful tales of service, sacrifice, and the warriors who serve with honor in silence. These stories preserve the legacy and courage of those who serve. They remind us why respect should be our default, not something withheld until proven necessary. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us, have you ever witnessed a moment where assumptions were shattered by reality? Where someone quiet proved to be the most capable person present? These stories matter. These lessons endure. And these warriors deserve to be remembered not for how others saw them, but for who they truly were when it mattered most. Until next time, stay vigilant. Stay humble. And never forget that the person you underestimate today might be the one who saves your life tomorrow. This is the final watch, preserving the stories that matter.